Okay, our third panel of the afternoon is Beyond the Military Unsung Heroes. It is going to be facilitated by Kathleen Koch, and they will be taking their places momentarily. She will introduce her panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the introduction, Susan. I'm really happy that you're all here to join us this afternoon. I've spent the majority of my career as a journalist, and I think it's really important that when we think about PTSD, trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and the different brain injuries that can be caused by exposure to trauma, that we look beyond the military, and that's what this panel is here to do, because there are other professions where people, as a part of their jobs, every day run toward disaster and crisis, and that can take a toll on you. And so that's why today we're really going to look at first responders, firefighters, police officers, journalists who are not first responders. We are sometimes the first ones on the scene, and then so many volunteers for terrific organizations like the Red Cross, again, who are not first responders, but who are there very early and also stay very long, and that can have a great impact on them. So I've got a great panel. I will briefly introduce them. Their full bios are in the program, but first next to me, Mark DeBona. He's a retired police officer and is currently public information officer at the wonderful nonprofit Blue Help. Next to him, and flew in from Florida. We've got a panel that's come a great distance. In from Oregon is Tim Dietz. Tim's a retired fire captain and paramedic and is now a licensed professional counselor and owner of Behavioral Wellness Resources. Next to him, Ilana came in this morning from Tulsa, so thanks for making it. Ilana, she's research director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma and co-director of the University of Tulsa Institute of Trauma, Adversity, and Injustice. And then finally, with the American Red Cross, where she's manager of disaster health and mental health services, is Valerie Cole. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to start with you, Mark. You've just retired from a 33-year career in law enforcement, both in Massachusetts and in Florida. And I'd like for you to help us understand this problem in the police forces or sheriff's departments around the country. Talk to us about some of the situations you find yourself in and the toll it can take.
Well, in my 33 years on the job, what put a toll on me was the violence and the death that I saw, such as I went to 9/11. I volunteered 2 weeks in New York City. That was one of my biggest things I've did in my career. Also, dealing with child death and dealing with the violence. And then, but I'm going to be brutally honest when I say this, a lot of police stress comes from within the agency. And what I mean from within the agency is the unfairness, or a lot of officers feel like the agency doesn't care about them.
Now, you sort of skimmed over that child death. Would you share with us the story about what you experienced? And was that the incident that pushed you over the edge?
That was probably the main incident. Basically what happened was I was sitting at a fire station. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. Then the fire department just went out on a call. And a car pulled up next to me, and this woman jumped out. She handed me her 4-month-old baby and said, "I don't think it's breathing." And it wasn't. And I did CPR. I got on a radio call for the fire department. And it seemed like it took forever the fire department to get there. In all reality, they got there pretty quick. But when you're doing CPR on a 4-month-old, it's absolutely horrific with the family there screaming, "Do something, do something." Well, unfortunately, the baby didn't make it. I developed what we call survivor guilt, where you could have done something more or something better or something like that. Survivor guilt led into nightmares, flashbacks, and a horrific nightmare that had an oncoming, that had continuously was, I go to my mailbox and the baby was in my mailbox. Or one time we were eating dinner at the dining room table, my wife and I and my brother, and just out of the clear blue, I looked at an empty chair and I saw the baby sitting there. And that was the flashbacks.
And that caused you to contemplate suicide at one point.
The totality of that, the totality of everything I saw in my career, on a personal level, I was a victim of child molestation for years by a police officer. I grew up fatherless. My father left us when at a young age, who was my mentor, my role model, who turned to abuse me through that. And then I had some difficult times within the agency I'm the kind of guy that says it like it is. and a lot of bosses don't want to hear the answer. And through the totality of that, that led to my suicidal what's the word I'm looking for?
Ideation.
Ideation, that's it, that's it.
Tim, you, I know, retired yourself from 30 years in the fire service. You're now a licensed professional counselor, and you focus on helping firefighters, helping police officers like Mark. How representative is his story of what you hear on a daily basis?
Mark's story is quite common, unfortunately. Our population, same as the military, parallels police officers, firefighters in the United States, more apt to die by their own hand than on the job. And one of the things that Mark shared, which we tend not to talk a lot about, is many of the population that I work with today have a childhood background like Mark does, which makes them comfortable in chaos, makes them drawn to a helping profession where they want people comfortable in chaos. But that population tends to fill up a little sooner than people that don't have that background, and then they end up in my office with a stress-related injury.
You know, how serious is the problem nationwide? I'll tell you, I was trying to find some numbers myself, and you really couldn't find hard and fast numbers. And the National Alliance on Mental Illness says between 7 and 19% of police officers experience PTSD. In one study, firefighters put their rates at 13%. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, the most recent research that I have read comes from the International Association of Firefighters, and it has the post-traumatic stress disorder rate at 20% by the time they retire, because it's mostly cumulative for us. But yes, it's a problem.
Cumulative, it's interesting. I think that one of the presenters earlier talking about disasters seemed to indicate that what people bring to that trauma that they experience from a disaster then will impact their outcomes. So, Alana, I'd like to go to you. So, I know people might be surprised that we're discussing journalists and trauma. How vulnerable are journalists?
So I want to thank, first of all, can you hear me?
No, it doesn't appear to be on. Let's see.
I think that's the difference. Thank you for including journalists. Most people don't think about journalists as being first on the scene, but they are witnessing the bravery of firefighters, of police officers. They're seeing the wins and the loses. They're seeing disasters, and they are our voice. And to talk about them, I think, is really important. When we started this work 20 years ago, nobody thought about journalists. And now we're seeing that their rates of PTSD are also high, not quite as high. Just to put the 20% you were talking about in context, in the US, 10%, 60% of people are exposed to a traumatic event, and in the general population, 10% is usually who once exposed go on to develop. So that gives you a sense of how high it is. It varies with journalists, but it ranges from anywhere in studies from 4% to those covering drug cartels, for those vetted in combat, and for those who are war correspondents as high as 25%. So that
You know,
gives you some
it's
context.
interesting because it must be cumulative, sort of like with the law enforcement officers as well. I mean, myself personally, I never thought about it. And then I covered 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. And then I was the nighttime reporter during the sniper attacks in Montgomery County, where I stood there every night with bright lights shining on me while everyone else was huddled in their homes with their shades drawn. And I think for me, it was Hurricane Katrina that pushed me, beyond the breaking point, because there I was reporting live on basically the destruction of my hometown. I'd grown up in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, and interviewing the survivors in the streets who'd lost everything were my classmates and my neighbors. And I'm standing there on this slab that was the house where I'd grown up. And nothing prepared me for that. And I think it was, again, being there before 8, when there was such need, when there was such chaos. And I didn't have the means to help the people I wanted to help. And maybe this is, I hear moral injury. Maybe it's that as well. It hurt, just killed me that here I was. To be a good person, you should help people. But I couldn't. I just had to do my job, and it didn't seem like enough.
The role of professional bystander is a hard role for that very reason.
Brutal.
And people are not trained for it.
Valerie, I'd like to talk about the Red Cross. Now, as I said, you weren't exactly first responders, but you go in there really quickly and after all sorts of events, hurricanes, house fires, mass casualty events like mass shootings and plane crashes. What do you see as far as the impacts on your staffs when they are in these very traumatic situations?
Well, it's true that we're not first responders, but we do go in very quickly after an event occurs. And I think since we're not first responders, we're not going in to try to save lives per se. However, if we don't provide services, lives do become lost. And I think most of our workforce is 90% volunteer. So we have people who come from all walks of life who go into disaster situations and are not necessarily as well prepared as perhaps a firefighter or a police officer who may expect to have some difficult, challenging situations like that. But we go into communities. I remember being in Joplin, Missouri after the hurricane went through in 2011. And just seeing the whole Main Street, the whole downtown area of Joplin was completely flattened. It was as though a huge bomb had gone off. And just seeing that level of destruction definitely has an emotional impact on you. And I think one of the things that I believe it was Mark mentioned is that the difficulty of providing services, sometimes there are organizational challenges that just increase the stress. So I was in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and there was an incredible need for services. And we were having trouble getting things to people because of lots of reasons, some of which were bureaucratic snafus, logistical snafus. Some of it was that the roads were blocked because of the debris of the hurricane. The power was out, the water was out, and so we knew that people were in dire need of food and of other kinds of services, and we just weren't able to get to them. Or even if we did get to them, there was not much we could do when we did get there. And that the stress on the responders was extremely high during that time.
Such a high sense of helplessness.
Right, it's helplessness and it's guilt, because we did have enough food for ourselves, and we did have power most of the time, not all the time. I didn't have water all the time either. But I was in better shape than a lot of people in the villages where we were going. And so, yes, there was a certain amount of guilt.
Yeah,
And that's very similar to journalists. It's also consistent with the studies that, I was thinking about it when you spoke, Mark, too. The studies that my students and I have shown, it's not just exposure. It's exposure being in an environment, an occupational environment, which is somehow toxic or has toxic stress that, in fact, puts people at the greatest risk who are first on the scene. And I think that's important because it speaks to the ways that we can try. Some of these are realistic obstacles that we're not going to be able to face, but some obstacles exist in organizations that don't need to exist, and we can look at social support and we can look at ways of moving forward to help all those folks.
Right, and I think with the Red Cross anyway, because of our recent experiences, I also was helping people after 9/11.
Right, but by phone you told me you weren't even
I
talking to them
wasn't
in
even
person.
Yeah, so
The people who responded.
one of the things that we encourage our responders, and I'm sure you all have this same experience, is that if somebody has recently had losses or recently had a trauma in their life, they probably shouldn't respond to that situation, to the next Katrina or the next 9/11 immediately after the trauma that they've just experienced.
They need time to heal.
You need time to heal. So when 9/11 happened, I was living in upstate New York, and many of the responders from the chapter I was volunteering in, most of the mental health responders, as I was, were going down to Manhattan to work with people down in Manhattan near Ground Zero. And they asked me if I wanted to go. Well, I had had several things happen that summer that just made me say, no, I'm sorry, death and destruction, not right now, thank you. So I thought I was being really smart, and I stayed home, but I also wanted to do something. So for the people who were coming back from New York, I and another volunteer started calling everyone who was coming back and saying how'd it go, doing a debriefing with them, being able to provide support, listen to their stories, thank them for having gone, for what they did. So we did that. We started 2 weeks after 9/11 when the first people started coming back and continued through the end of November. By somewhere in mid-November, I was having nightmares about the towers and about the barge that went around the bottom of the island that allowed people to see where the towers had gone down, et cetera. So
And that's compassion fatigue?
that was compassion fatigue. I was nowhere near Manhattan. I mean, I certainly had seen all the footage on TV, but it was really from listening to stories of other people who had been helping the people who had lost a loved one during the tower attacks. So, yes, it can happen even if you're not right on the scene. If you have to listen to those stories, as journalists do, then you can develop compassion fatigue without ever going there.
Mark, I'd like to talk about stigma because that's such a huge issue, especially in law enforcement. How tough was it? When and where, how did you decide to share what you were going through? What was the reaction?
Well, when I decided to get to help, and I knew I needed to get help, the boss told me, my wife, that you need to get some help. Here's the deal. I was petrified that I was going to lose my job. I was afraid that we have a terminology in law enforcement we call the rubber gun squad. And they're going to put me on the rubber gun squad. They're going to terminate me. They're going to reassign me or something like that.
Desk duty.
Desk duty, exactly. Something I did not want to do, obviously. And I was very, very afraid of that, and that added more to my stress. So when I decided to get help, I actually went back to Boston, where I was born, and the Boston Police Department has a phenomenal peer support, the Boston Police Stress Unit. That's where I received my help. And the reason why I went from Florida to Boston was hoping that my agency wouldn't find out. So I asked
You tried to keep it secret.
I tried to keep it secret as best as I could. I called my boss, made up a lie, and said that, hey, my mom's sick. I need to go back home for a couple of weeks, and then that was it. When I came back to, and that prevents officers from getting help, is the stigma. It's the most powerful word in mental health, in my opinion, is stigma. When I came back to Florida, I went from one therapist to another, and finally I found my present therapist, who I absolutely adore. And I said, well, now it's time to come out with it. And I came out with it, but I came out very angry because I felt that the agency turned their backs on me. And that pretty much backfired on my face, where to the point where I had people come up to me and say, I can't work with you. You had your gun in your mouth 2 months ago. How can I trust you in a lethal situation? You need to quit. A couple of people called me worthless, weak.
How did you deal with that?
It wasn't easy, but I went on a mission. My mission was to prove them wrong, that I am a strong person, because the most difficult hurdle to come over is when you have a mental health illness. I'm diagnosed with PTSD, depression, and anxiety, and what's the biggest hurdle is admitting that you have it, and now take something bad and making something good of it. I'll give you an example. I did a news interview, and I went to the firing range the next day to requalify, and two of the guys I worked side by side with said, we can't work with you. We're afraid you're literally going to shoot us if you go crazy. The one that made a joke, well, you're already crazy. And I gotta be honest with that, that hurt. It really did. But I turned my pain, I took away the anger, took away the pain. Now my job is to help my brothers and sisters.
Wow, bravo.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Tim, is the stigma as great in fire departments around the country? Do they have that same, I guess in many ways I see this sense of machismo. You can't, if you admit you have emotions and feelings, you're weak.
Yes, I guess we learned that growing up, I would assume. I think the fire service really parallels law enforcement. To be a firefighter, I'm assuming to be a police officer, same thing. I have to believe that I can control things. I have to believe that when I show up, things are going to get better. I have to believe I can make organization out of chaos. I have to believe that bad things are not going to bother me. Things will improve when I show up.
Well, I'm already hearing the Mission Impossible music playing.
And then when I go on one of those scenes and one of those things doesn't prove to be reality, it gets me sideways. Showing emotions at a scene is not means I'm not in control. And what I'm trying to do is, I'm not saying to break down at a scene, but at some point you have to have a normal human reaction to a horrible event. That's the challenge.
Ilana, I was floored when you and I were talking, and you said there's actually more stigma for journalists. Explain that.
So journalists, there are structures, and at least there's some training. I'm not saying it's great training, but there is some awareness of these issues for first responders. For journalists, it's absolutely stigmatized. And then the other part is so many work in freelance organizations that there's no help available in that way. And I think the other part is this issue about emotional training. I think your organization does a good job of it to some degree. Journalists don't talk about emotions till they're talking about their audience. And I think that all of us need to become more emotionally literate. And I think that when you are dealing with someone who's experienced tragedy, if you are truly engaged with them, you can't help but feel emotions. And we all need to learn to deal with that. And that is part of all of these jobs, and I think it's an important part that we don't acknowledge, and it has its consequences. Some of them are good. I also have a greater faith in humanity, but I also have seen the sad parts of it as well, and I don't know if you share that.
Definitely. I've seen some people that have, the workforce that we have, the 90% volunteer workforce that we have, are incredibly giving and strong and compassionate. So, and we've seen what happens during a disaster, almost any kind of disaster, whether it's a mass casualty or a plane crash or a hurricane, tornado, whatever, the first people who are responding are your neighbors. And it's incredible to see the amount of compassion and the amount of generosity that comes forth from people who are helping each other. I'm sure you saw that in Mississippi
Sure.
after Hurricane Katrina. And so that's the compassion and that's the generosity that the American Red Cross could not do its work without that, for sure.
How do you prepare your volunteers, though, before they deploy to these sites? Can you share with us some of the tools that you give them?
Yeah, sure. We have several different things, and this has been growing over the years. We've also had to battle the stigma because many of our leadership and kind of the history of the volunteer workforces, we've had a lot of emergency managers who are wannabe firefighters or policemen or who come from the military, and so there's a fair amount of machismo.
So there's stigma even in the Red Cross.
A little bit. It's more subtle. It's not as, it's not institutionalized in that way, but it's there. If you can't handle it, maybe this isn't a good position for you, But that being said, we are getting better over time. And so just recently we instituted a task force for workforce care. And some of the things that we do is before people go out on an assignment, we have a self-assessment that they can take online by themselves. They don't have to share the results with anybody. And it's a series of questions that kind of goes over what's currently going on in your life. Are you really prepared to do this? And so by people being able to take it by themselves with nobody else seeing the results, they can opt out, like I did at 9/11. They can opt out of going on a response that may be problematic for them, and they don't have to lose face.
So that form they fill out, so then it gives them some guidance. If you score number 8 out of 15, maybe you should rethink,
Right,
your ability
absolutely.
to go and do this assignment.
And then we have other, we do try to make sure that they understand where they're going, what they're going to be faced with. So we classify different disasters based on the kinds of hardships that the workforce is going to be
Really?
dealing with. Are there going to be housing shortages, power outages, extreme heat, extreme cold. We don't usually do extreme cold, but we do extreme heat. Things like that, so people can make decisions on their own. Can I handle that kind of a situation? Is it going to be a really stressful, so if it's a mass casualty, are you able to deal with people who may be expressing their grief in very emotionally expressive ways? Are you going to be able to deal with people who have just lost everything, including a loved one? So we ask them those kinds of questions. And then we have brochures like for the family, when your loved one is out on a disaster, you may not be able to get a hold of them because communication may be challenged, but they're going to be okay. Then we also do provide support while people are on disaster. Part of our disaster mental health team, everyone is trained in staff mental health interventions as well. So we have mental health folks, psychologists, counselors, social workers who are on the ground, who are available for support. We've also instituted having people who can't deploy, mental health folks who are unable to deploy for whatever reason, they call the responders. So during Maria, when I was in Puerto Rico, I didn't get a call because the phones weren't working, but I got an email from a mental health person saying, just checking in with you, wanted to see how you're doing.
And that's effective, just that check-in.
It's great because it's not, we're not talking with them about their severe emotional distress, but we are checking in and letting them know that people care, giving them an outlet. So we don't push for people to give us details of what's going on with them, but we create an environment where they can talk about whatever they want to talk about. So if they are feeling really stressed, or if they have been witnessing, people crying, people being upset, people having lost everything, scenes of death and destruction, because just the scene itself can be pretty stressful. We give them an opportunity to talk about it, and then they also have a phone number of somebody that they can call whenever they want to and continue the conversation. And then when people get home, we also provide support when they get home as well.
Mark, right now you are volunteering, speaking of volunteering, for the nonprofit Blue Help. And you go around the country and you talk to police departments. And I know also when you were still on the job in Florida that you actually taught mental health, suicide prevention at the police academy in Sanford, Florida. Could you share with us some of the things that you do tell your peers and recruits as to what they're going to face, but how to get through it?
Well, one thing I tell people is this: it's okay to hurt, it's okay to feel bad, it's okay to fight the demons, and I tell them you've got to address your issues. You can't just push them aside. You've just got to go full force. And I use myself as an example. As don't become me. Of the 4 or 5 months that I was suicidal with my weight gain and my anger, my outburst and my anger, and nearly losing my job because of it, I said, learn from the mistakes I made. And I tell such as the recruits in the academy, I tell them this: you're going to see things that we weren't designed to see. The violence again, the death, the tragedies, things like that. And I tell them you have to prepare yourself for that. And if you think you can't handle that, then maybe it's time to think of another job. And I know it sounds cold when I say that, because in Florida it costs about $9,000 to go to the academy, and it comes out of your own pocket if you're not sponsored. But I had a student say to me one time, well, I'm glad you told me that, because this job is not for me. Because they watched a video on homicide investigation, and they said, we can't do this. Now, as far as the active law enforcement officers go, is I tell them, go get help. It's we have a program in Blue Help. We call it Bring a Buddy. So if you want to go get help, but you don't know how to get help, I would come in and say, hey, listen, I can turn you on to this therapist, or I can bring you here. I'll drive you there. I'll pick you up. Whatever needs to be done, have their backs, and that's what we do. As brothers and sisters, we have to have each other's backs. So the biggest thing I tell active law enforcement officers is it's okay to hurt, but you don't want it to build up and build up and build up till you get to your breaking point. Unfortunately, a lot of agencies, when I go around the country and I talk about peer support and I talk about suicide prevention, I hear from chiefs or sheriffs or administrators, we just don't have the money to implement, to get a program like this.
But kind of doesn't sound like that buddy program would be very expensive.
It's not. It's really not. I'll give you an example. I was in Kentucky, and my Boston accent went over really well in Kentucky, but that's besides the point. So, but what it was this: the chief said to me, "We're a 10-man police department. I can't afford a peer support unit." And I said, "Well, let's do this. Let's get together with the other cities within your county and see if you can do a county-wide peer support unit." And myself and another member of Blue Help went out there and helped them set up the unit. Now it's a 25-person volunteer peer support unit, and each department pledges some money into it. But the thing I want to express the most, you can't put money on somebody that's hurt, or hurting, I should say. So you got to find that money somewhere.
Tim, talk to us about the kind of advice that you give to police and fire departments around the country to both prevent these, I think, what did you say, you call them mental stress injuries, and then to heal themselves after they occur?
Yeah, one of the things that I find is one of my challenges is I have to change the culture in emergency services. The culture that we're tough, things don't bother us, showing an emotion is a sign we're broke, is a sign we chose the wrong career. We gotta get out of that way of thinking. When I show emotion to something, all that means is that I'm a human being and I just experienced something that maybe I shouldn't have to experience, right? And so what I tend to do is, if I go into an organization to help change that culture, unfortunately, typically it's after a suicide or two, we talk about the sources of stress, right? Not only the operations that we do, but also the politics of working in public agencies create a lot of stress. We talk about what that tends to look like, the physical, the emotional, the behavioral, the spiritual responses of stress. And then we give them tools on this is how you can enhance your resiliency to get through it in a timely manner. The big picture is I want to teach all the employees of that organization how to take care of themselves and each other, because a coworker of Mark here would have noticed Mark was struggling before maybe Mark even knew he was struggling. And wouldn't it have been cool for that coworker to have a conversation with you and said, hey, I'm worried about you. Are you talking to somebody? I can help find somebody for you. Or let's go for a walk, let's go for a jog, and try to get Mark back on his feet. Because what I've kind of discovered is people that are wired to be helpers, when things outside of our control happen, we quit taking care of ourselves. So sometimes it's up to the coworker. Then I do create internal resources, hence peer team development. We identify external resources, culturally competent people in the community. To knock that stigma off, if something's bothering you, we expect you to go tell somebody to get back on your feet.
Ilana, in the journalism profession, what entities are starting to acknowledge the seriousness of this problem, and who's really stepping up to the plate? Are we talking about universities? Are there major news organizations, newspapers, television networks?
Well, we do many of the same kinds of things, and a lot of news organizations are stepping up. There was a case in Australia 3 weeks ago, the first news agency to be held liable for their employee who had PTSD and not doing anything about it. And so it's kind of interesting. A lot of public radio and public television stations have been interested in that, BBC across the world, ABC in Australia. And more agencies are starting to do it. Also, news organizations themselves. I do a lot of training at professional organizations. And after...
So like the Society of Professional Journalists?
Like the investigative reporters, meetings, or college media, college newspapers. We do a lot of training in professional organizations. And then universities are now starting to do this as well. Universities are starting to train students. One thing that I thought about is also we're working on what makes you a resilient worker. And I think there are a couple of things there in addition to some of the things you mentioned. Always knowing how did you get through the hard times. I think the issue of mission, all of these folks that we're representing have a purpose and a mission, and doing a job well is really an important thing, and remembering one's mission. Journalism is under attack, and they really do feel, I think journalists feel like their mission is being attacked, and that is eroding, I think, some of it. And it's my push to say that when you see good journalism, I hope you will reach out and compliment as much as criticize when you don't see it. But it's really important, I think, to acknowledge the important work that people do, and that people need to take pride in their work, and that's also an important resiliency factor.
Ilana, what about also that what Valerie mentioned earlier, the way the Red Cross will call and check in, hey, how you doing? Are news organizations beginning to realize that's important? And I think
Some do, and some
having a plan, because when you're in the middle of these major crises and you feel like you're just sort of out there and there is no plan, and that you've been forgotten and you're in the middle of this disaster zone, it's unsettling.
Yes, some do and some don't, and we actually learn from Red Cross. I'm also a Red Cross volunteer. But the logistics person was the person who was ending up doing the mental health early on in the field for journalists, and I think that was also true at one point in Red Cross, and that wasn't the person who was trained. They were trained to do logistics. And so we've learned that there are ways. So some managers in certain organizations, what we do is we try to adapt it to organizations. There are some news organizations that are top down, and then you want to work within the managerial system. And like the military has done some things top down. There's some where you want to work grassroots and you want to work with peers. There's some that you want to do sideways. And we're just trying to figure out all the different ways that we can help people be resilient and help the field.
And the disaster mental health activity in the Red Cross has only been around for 25 years, which, and it was started in '94 originally specifically for staff mental health in order to help our staff who were dealing with the stress of working in disasters and dealing with some of these horrendous sites that we see. And the problem, though, was that initially staff, the psychologists and the social workers who were part of our disaster mental health team had the ability to recommend that somebody be sent home if they weren't doing well. So we kind of got a bad reputation that, you don't want to talk to a mental health person because if you do, you'll get sent home. And it's that whole saving face and being macho and being strong. If you have to be able to work 12 hours a day for a month straight and not complain about it. It has changed over the years, and I think it's changed for all of our organizations, that at this point, the need for support, especially the peer support that you were talking about, we teach everybody psychological first aid. All of Red Cross responders are encouraged to take psychological first aid, and many of them have to in order to move up in whatever activity they're in. So that, and what we teach in psychological first aid is these are the typical responses to stress. If you see a coworker who is acting in a different way or more so than you would expect, please say something to them. If you can't, if they're not listening to you, you can find a mental health person and talk to them. But we really want to make sure that everybody in the organization has kind of the basics of how to take care of a person who's dealing with what we call disaster stress, but it's similar to, other types of stress as well. How do you take care of somebody, whether they're your neighbor, whether they're your kid, or whether they're your coworker? And so we're trying to do that as well.
And I think you name a tension that's really there, which is in all our professions, I think, which is when the organization takes somebody away from it and when they hold them there. I trained after 9/11, I trained all the New York organizations in the best practice for PTSD. I would have sent my loved ones to these EAP providers, and the journalist said, there's no way I'm going to my employee assistance program. They're used by management to fire me.
Right.
I don't trust them. Now, it varies from organization. And this is not all, it varies, but some cultures, you do not go to your employee
Of course
assistance
not.
program, and in some you do. And so we really need to think about all the multiple channels in an organization and an organizational culture to allow people to make the most of it.
Right.
I know after Katrina, when I ended up in therapy, it was a little more than a year after the storm had hit. I didn't really share it with CNN. I was covering the White House then. I was really worried if I said anything to anyone, I'd get pulled off the beat.
Right, and one of the things that we're instituting is a staff support hotline for both employees and volunteers, so that, and it'll be an anonymous hotline where people in the organization can call and speak to a mental health person. They don't even have to give their name, but one of the reasons we wanted to set it up was so that if I'm in a small chapter in, Kentucky or Illinois, where there's only 4 employees, I don't necessarily want my boss or my other coworkers to know that I'm having some issues because of the last disaster I responded to. So this way they will have a phone number that they can call, that they will talk to a disaster mental health person who understands the culture, who understands the types of stresses that we're exposed to, and who will, it'll be completely safe.
Tim and Mark, could that work in law enforcement and the fire service?
Oh, absolutely. We do a lot of work to identify culturally competent people.
But I'm saying the anonymity, having that kind of a hotline where you could reach out and get the help.
It's
but
pretty
not
much you can
put
reach
your
out,
job at risk.
and the organization shouldn't be able to find out about that. If they found out about it, nobody would ever use it, ever. So it's pretty anonymous, at least in Oregon it is, unless it's a mandatory report, obviously.
What do you think, Mark?
Well, one thing I wanted to say about peer support is I was at an agency doing a presentation, and I noticed when I went to meet with the chief of police there before the presentation, when I got up to the second floor, I saw the chief's office, the colonel, the major, the captain, and the next room over was peer support. And I walked in the chief's office, I'm like, that's got to go. And he's like, well, I understand what you mean. I said, think about this. An officer in crisis is going to go get help, but he has to walk past all 4 of those doors. That's more stress. And the officers are going to think, oh, is it like a hidden camera in here or something like that? And I struggle with EAP also, wondering if it was confidential or if it was they were going to report back. So a confidential number is a good thing, absolutely. It's getting the ball rolling, but the follow-up is more important than getting the ball rolling.
Alana and Valerie, I was wondering, with law enforcement and firefighters, we do hear the suicide numbers. Is that an issue when it comes to journalists, volunteers? I mean, obviously, we generally will not, certainly as compared to law enforcement, we don't have that access generally to firearms, et cetera.
There are suicides, and there are some well-known suicides of some photographers. There are suicides. I don't know if it's as high a rate. I was actually just going over the suicide literature on the plane this morning for military and wondering about that myself. And I was looking at military and after-school shootings, thinking about the news this last week and seeing what I could learn. But I don't think we have those numbers.
We don't have any numbers at all around that around suicide, and just based on my 20 years with the Red Cross, I don't think that's an issue. I think what happens is that people who are, because since everybody is a volunteer, they can quit really quickly, really easily, and I think that's what happens. We lose lots of people who are stressed because of. And I don't think we have a high rate of PTSD either. Certainly not more than the 10% general population rate. Because I think what we're dealing with more than PTSD is the compassion fatigue. And what we know about compassion fatigue is that when you rest and you get away from it, then you can recover. You can recover from compassion fatigue a lot more easily than you can recover from post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I think that's generally what we're dealing with more so than PTSD. And I don't think we have suicides, or at least not that I know
I was
of.
going to say, how do you track it if they've left?
I would not know, but I just, based on being around for a while, I don't think so.
Personal experience.
And as I'm thinking about it, I suspect it's higher because depression is the other thing that we see quite a bit, and substance abuse. And those two are also risk factors for suicide. So I think we need to start asking those questions.
On that subject, Mark, I know you've lost several friends to suicide, and I'm sure if you talk to anyone in law enforcement, they could name at least one or two, peers who have taken their own lives. If you could change one thing in the law enforcement culture that you think would really make a difference here, either in preventing the suicides or in helping prepare people better for the kinds of traumas they're going to face daily on the job, what would you change?
Well, I'll go back to the stigma. The stigma's got to change, and the way suicide's the elephant in the room, and they have to be addressed at academy level or even college level. The stresses that goes within on the job, but the most important thing is the bosses have to be on board. I spoke to several chiefs and sheriffs. Oh, we don't have suicide issues in my agency. We never had one. So my question to him was, well, you know everything that's going on in your agency? Well, of course not. So we got to get away from the stigma, and that's going to be part of the curriculum in the academy. It's going to be an in-service training, and as a recent retiree of less than a month, also has to go on into retirement also. When I signed my retirement papers, I was asking the HR people, what about this, what about this? Oh, well, we're not sure. Well, that gave me some stress, because I want my pension, obviously. And so I think it's about education, and I'll use this terminology, the squeaky wheel gets the oil.
Tim, what about you when you look down the road? If there's something that we as a nation could really change to help address this problem?
I have to concur with what Mark's saying. It is a stigma, and we have to get out of that. Being impacted is a sign of weakness. We've been doing a lot of work teaching people that it is okay to reach out. Listen, we weren't born with folders of where you put some of this stuff, these tragedies, the dead kids, the carnage, the violence against each other. We weren't born with those folders. So when they happen, there's people out there, we do a lot of work, there's people out there that you can talk to. There's some treatment modalities that tend to be fairly effective with the treatment of post-traumatic stress injury, so to speak. And it is okay to reach out. Nobody needs to know. You can continue in a career that when Mark was hired, I'm assuming he thought he had the best gig in the world, as well as everybody in your professions. We think we have the best job in the world. And sometimes it's sad that the toll of our experiences take on us. And we have to have resources available to watch out for that, to get people back.
You know, Alana, you mentioned depression, and I think we all recall the shocking suicide of Anthony Bourdain over the past year. And I don't know that he had any exposure to trauma in particular. I mean, he looked like he had a terrific life and a terrific job, but what do you think in our profession, what needs to change to make sure that the problem is taken more seriously and that people get help?
In journalism?
In journalism.
So, and I should say I'm not a journalist, I'm a journalist ally, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I think in your profession, I'll say, I think that stigma needs to be addressed. I think we need to get numbers. I think we need to provide health services for journalists and mental health services. It's very hard to find them. And I think we need more numbers and support to help justify that. But we need more health services and mental health services for journalists.
And before we go to the audience for questions, and I'll be getting your questions together, Valerie, I'd like to ask you to chime in here. And besides giving us your thoughts on what one thing would you change, there's something we haven't talked about, and that's post-traumatic stress growth. So I'd sort of like to end on a high note, because I know personally, after everything that I went through, and I was in a very, very dark place for a while, I came through it, and I feel I'm a different person. I'm not the person I was the day before Hurricane Katrina struck, but I'm a stronger person, and I think that's good.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Post-traumatic growth is definitely a real thing, and it's so for the volunteers that make up the disaster workforce in Red Cross. The mission is what drives everybody. The mission is what makes people work 12 hours a day for weeks at a time. And so it's a good thing, because we're out there, we're humanitarians, we're out there trying to help people recover from severe losses. And even though it's really, really difficult, and by the time you go home, one of the difficulties is that you go home and your family is still like doing laundry, going to the grocery store, doing all these normal things that they do. I was a psychologist for quite a while. I was in private practice when I was doing some of my volunteer work, and I'd come back and my clients would be talking about fights with their husband, or and I'd be like, but you don't understand. Mm-hmm. These people just lost everything, and you're worried about that petty fight with your husband. So, that's a stressor, but I think in the long run, one of the reasons and I was thinking about this as you were talking, I think one of the reasons our volunteers don't probably commit suicide is because they're doing it because it's a choice. It's not their identity. It's not their livelihood. Their families aren't depending on them to be a policeman or be a fireman or be a journalist. They're doing it because they love the work. And when they go home after having, I know when I got home from Puerto Rico, a year or two ago, it feels like 10 years ago, and it feels like I was there for 10 years. I was exhausted. I slept for a week because it was such a difficult response. It was so hard, so noisy, so much need, and so difficult to do anything. But then in the long run, after I recovered, after I slept for, quite a while, I was able to say, I did something good. I did something good. I feel good about what I did. It's easier for me to put my problems in perspective when I look at, what these people were dealing with. I appreciate having a toilet that flushes. I appreciate being able to turn on the light and turn on the tap and, and drive down the street and have a stoplight that is working. I appreciate that stuff, and I think that's part of post-traumatic growth is that you learn from the experience in such a way that it helps you understand who you are better and where you fit in the world, and it just kind of reminds you of what's important as well. So.
Thank you. And now we have a terrific audience, and probably would do you good to stand up and stretch and ask a question. So Mary Lowe has a microphone. Mary Lowe, we have a question, a couple of them right here in the front, our frequent questioners.
Hi, I work with veterans, and a lot of them, as you know, are also police officers and firemen. And one of the most bizarre sets of experiences I have had have been working with police chiefs and fire chiefs in my life.
Explain.
Okay, so the weirdest one was, and I don't know how I got there, but I was invited to, 6 years ago, the Attorney General's Law Enforcement Chiefs Summit. And I was invited there as a behavioral health expert, so I thought I was there to talk about post-traumatic stress, because that's what I do. And there were 28 chiefs there, and 26 of those police chiefs from every large community and some of the small communities, 26 of them said, we don't have any problem with post-traumatic stress, we don't have any problem with suicide, we don't have a problem with drinking, and we don't have a problem with depression. And I thought
That's
I was
called
living
denial,
in an
right?
alternate universe.
Hence the problem.
And so, yeah, I see the problem. Here's my question for the two of you. What do you think we need to do at that level to be able to begin to address some of the problems that you see on the ground level?
And actually, to add to that, for this panel, as I was looking for information and participants, I thought, I'll reach out to, for the very reasons that you mentioned, that the chiefs may be in denial. Well, I thought, I'll reach out to the Fraternal Order of Police. They represent their members, right? They would be concerned about and aware of this issue. No response. So take it away.
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because that is a huge problem. I think the best answer would be those folks need to retire out, but that's not going to happen as quickly as we would like. I think law enforcement is ahead of the game than the fire service is in recognizing they truly have a stress-related problem in their workforce. Fire service has still not admitted that we have a problem. There's suicides happening in Oregon right now that will not make any statistic because that was a horrible accident. Police figured out a long time ago the accidental discharge of the weapon in the squad room probably wasn't an accident. The poor officer that accidentally hit the tree and was unrestrained probably wasn't an accident. The fire service is not there yet. And unfortunately, it's not until somebody suicides in that organization, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 12, like what happened in Phoenix, Arizona, that they start to figure out maybe that is a problem. We're working really, really hard when we go in there and we talk about this culture. That's got to be bought in from top down. Everybody's got to buy in on this. So if I go into an organization to turn that culture around, the chief has to sit in the audience with the firefighters. You have to understand we have a problem, not only in this country, but in Western Europe and Canada as well. We kind of all model the same statistics as far as suicide rates. I don't know. Some organizations will say, well, if the chief doesn't show up, how do you want me to buy into this stuff if they don't think it's important? Then we call it trickle up. You guys take care of yourselves and each other. Eventually, you guys get promoted to those spots, and I'm afraid that's where we're at right now. Is these folks that got the training ground level to take care of themselves and each other. Stress is a problem, but there are ways to mitigate it and still stay employed. When those folks become chiefs, hopefully we'll have different things to worry about in the fire service.
If I could just jump in quickly, I think a lot of administrators forget where they came from because they don't work nights, holidays, or weekends. And when we have like an event like this, they send people to it, but they don't go. And like Tim said, they need to be in the audience hearing what's going on. And instead of sending a couple of people, then tell me how it went, and then now it's all secondhand. Now on the flip side of that, in a conference, when the bosses are around, people shut down. They're not going to speak freely, but they got to hear the cold, hard facts. Give you an example. Chicago PD has had 6 suicides in 8 months. What Chicago PD is doing to address that problem, honestly, I really don't know. But that's absolutely horrific. And the superintendent, chief, or whoever it is in charge of Chicago PD has got to really say, I've got an issue here, and I've got to make it better.
Do we have time for one quick question?
So my son was a sergeant in the Army. He served 8 years in the 82nd Airborne. He passed away in 2016 from addiction-related situation. When he was discovered to be an addict with PTSD during his service, at first he was tormented by the fact that everybody now knew his secret. And then he used his voice to communicate with the other soldiers that he worked with to say, look, I've accomplished all of these things and I'm still struggling. If you are struggling, come to me. I will help you figure out what to do. His leadership came to him and said, you have to stop talking to people about this because we don't want a group of weak soldiers. We want a group of soldiers who feel like they're invincible, right? So he left the service, and eventually we lost him because of his addiction. But when I see people that I know are struggling, I'm not always clear on how to start that conversation with them. Sometimes it's very clear to me. I'm just going to say, look, I'm the mom in the room and you have a problem. I can see it. What are you going to do about it? But sometimes people don't even realize they have a problem, or they refuse to admit they have a problem. What do you do when you encounter somebody that you know is struggling, and just not because you're afraid of your safety or the safety of anyone around them, but because you want to improve the quality of their lives? What do you do to encourage them to go get the help that they need?
When I was active, I was a sergeant, and I had a person on my squad that I noticed that her work, she was very aggressive. My microphone just died. She was very aggressive, made a lot of arrests, made a lot of citizen contacts, was really good in the community. But I noticed within a couple of weeks, it started going downhill a little bit. And I could see it on her face also. So I pulled her aside right after roll call, and I said, let's me and you go grab a cup of coffee, log yourself off as busy on the computer, and we ended up talking for about 2 hours. So I recognized, and she said, yeah, I'm having some marriage problems, I'm not sleeping, and I was able to get her some help. So I have a tattoo that says, not all scars are visible, and that's so 100% true. So to approach somebody, fortunately mine was a work relationship, so I was able to. To walk up to a stranger, that's difficult. More so to walk up to a cop and say, hey man, you feeling all right? Yeah, that's probably not going to work out too well. Here's Mr. Taser. Yeah, but again, like I said earlier, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. We got to take care of each other, whether cops, firefighters, Red Cross, or whoever, journalists, whoever. When we see somebody struggling, when we leaders struggling, just be there for them and say, hey, can I talk to you for a second? Everything okay? I just have to notice something about you. And if they talk, great. If they don't, well, we can't bend their arm, you know?
We have a tip sheet at the Dart Center called How to Be a Good Buddy, and it's just basically tips on how to be a good buddy. The end.
You know, absolutely, and I think in response to your question as well, to kind of add on, it is going to be a peer, another soldier, and so somebody, one of the panels this morning, one of the docs was talking about this psychological first aid. Wouldn't that be cool if that was taught in all schools in this country? Because soldiers are going to listen to other soldiers first. And when a soldier comes up to them and says, listen, I am worried about you. You want to say, I'm fine, I'm fine. Well, no, this is what I'm seeing. This worries me a little bit. Here's some things that we can, are you talking to somebody? Are you taking care of yourself? And I'm going to stay on them. And so I think the big picture is peers are what's going to help maybe soften what you are explaining.
All right,
Because I can go into a military unit and say, hey, I'm worried about you. They don't know who I am. They could care less what I'm saying. Another soldier, a peer, says, listen, this is what I've noticed. I am worried about this. I think that's the key to all of this. Same with journalists, same with everybody that's dealing with stress.
We have a special dispensation from Mary Lowe for one more question.
Yes, hello. I'm a veteran myself, and I've dealt with PTSD. Didn't realize I even had it until about a couple of years ago when I was out at my home and looked for a weapon when I heard a firearm go off. One thing I want to ask, have you all dealt with going into the local community, such as the schools? A lot of families really don't understand how to deal with PTSD. As we look at the suicidal rate of our children that have killed themselves, not just because of bullying, but of other affecting factors. So I have a question. Have you went into the community and maybe try to influence or engage and educate leaders such as teachers?
That's a wonderful idea. Has anyone done that on the panel? Sounds like that's a no, but that's an excellent idea. I think that's something that we should all consider. Anyway, thank you to our wonderful audience for your terrific questions, and please thank my terrific panel, Valerie, Alana, Tim, and Mark. You guys were terrific. Thanks.